What secrets are uncovered in the Gospel of Judas discovered in Egypt? Imagine for a moment the most infamous name in the Passion narratives, Judas Iscariot, recast not simply as a villain in a courtroom drama, but as the central confidant of a hidden teaching. That is the shock that greets anyone who opens this short, damaged manuscript, a gospel that does not rehearse miracles, births, or public sermons, but records a series of secret conversations in which Judas is singled out as the one who understands things the other disciples do not. We will explain what the Gospel of Judas actually says, show why scholars think it matters, and just as importantly, explain the limits of what the manuscript can prove. The physical story of the manuscript is itself part of the mystery. The codex was recovered from a cave in Upper Egypt in 1978 and then entered the opaque world of collectors and antiquities dealers. Over decades, it passed through multiple hands, and during that time, the pages were exposed to heat, humidity, and careless handling. By the time conservative restoration and scholarly attention began, perhaps 10 to 15% of the text was already lost. Entire lines and linking phrases are missing. The surviving language is Coptic, the Egyptian tongue used by many Christian and Gnostic communities. Paleographers date the surviving copy to roughly the 3rd or 4th century. Many scholars think the ideas it preserves, however, trace back earlier, possibly to traditions or writings of the 2nd century. In other words, what we read is a later Coptic copy of an earlier Greek or oral tradition. A scholarly edition of the text appeared in the early 2000s, and the manuscript entered broad public awareness when its publication and translation were widely publicized in the mid-2000s. That damaged condition has two consequences that govern everything we can say about the Gospel of Judas. First, key words and phrases are missing, so any reconstruction of some passages is tentative. Second, the codex itself came to us through the market rather than from a monastery or archaeological excavation, which complicates claims about the precise community that produced or used it. Because of those material uncertainties, caution must be the permanent companion of any bold claim. What kind of text is this? It is not a narrative gospel in the canonical sense. It does not tell a continuous life story of Jesus. Instead, it reads as a record of secret instruction, specifically a set of dialogues between Jesus and his disciples that culminate in extended exchanges with Judas. The conversations are said to take place over 8 days leading up to Passover. The distinctive formal feature is secrecy. The author frames the teaching as reserved for an inner circle, accessible to those who possess the proper interpretive keys. That closure shapes both the theology and the tone.
The most striking and newsworthy feature is simple. Judas is the only disciple named repeatedly, and he is presented as the one entrusted with a special revelation. Where the canonical Gospels depict Judas as the consummate traitor, this text offers a startling alternative, a disciple who may be performing a salvific role. To get to the heart of the content, we need to set out a few technical terms briefly and clearly. The word aeon or eon in Gnostic literature denotes an emanated divine power or realm. Imagine concentric rings of being radiating out from an ultimate source. The pleroma is the fullness of the divine realm, the totality of those emanated powers. Barbello is a name that appears frequently in Gnostic writings to refer to a first emanation or a kind of divine mind or maternal principle, a luminous presence that precedes the lesser beings. The demiurge, a term Gnostic and later Christian writers use, refers to the creator of the visible world. In these texts, that creator is not identical with the supreme God, but a lower, often ignorant or even arrogant entity. The Gospel of Judas uses names like Yaldabaoth, also rendered in some manuscripts as Nebro, and Soclus for such a figure. Soclus can be translated in a way that suggests folly or blindness. Those basic categories, pleroma, aeons, barbello, demiurge, form the scaffolding of the text's cosmology. The Gospel of Judas offers a layered cosmology familiar to other Gnostic texts. At the top is a great invisible spirit, the true God, who is beyond ordinary description. From that source emanate a sequence of divine beings, aeons, including Barbello. At some point, a lower being arises, Yaldabaoth, sometimes called Nebro or Soclus, who proclaims himself creator and fashions the material cosmos. This creator is not the true God, but an inferior artisan who traps divine sparks in matter. Human beings, in this view, are caught in the demiurge's realm. Their bodies and appetites belong to the lower world, while their true essence is a spark from the pleroma. Salvation in these systems is not primarily forgiveness of sins or sacrificial atonement. It is knowledge, gnosis, that lets the soul recognize its origin and find its way back through the layers that separate it from the divine fullness. Within that cosmic map, the Gospel of Judas offers an unusual reading of Jesus' identity and mission. Jesus, in the text, speaks often of his heavenly origin and repeatedly distinguishes the true God from the maker of this world. He tells Judas things that he explicitly refuses to tell the other disciples. At one point, the text records an exchange in which Jesus tells Judas that he will exceed the others. A short, damaged line reads in translation, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me."
That phrase has become a focal point for interpretation. If the man that clothes me is the fleshly human shell of Jesus, then Judas's action, handing Jesus over, might be portrayed as the act that frees the divine element from its material enclosure. In other words, what looks like betrayal from one perspective can be recast within this theology as a necessary step in releasing the heavenly element. This reinterpretation rests on a Gnostic anthropology and soteriology. Bodies are prisons for divine sparks. The creator of those prisons is an inferior power, and the pathway back to the pleroma depends on revelation that disentangles certain souls from material entanglement. The Gospel of Judas places Judas in precisely the role of confidant and instrument. The text's narrator suggests Judas is the only one who comprehends Jesus' true remarks and is told to act accordingly. One common phrasing scholars use is that Judas is a sacrificial agent whose willing action serves the salvific plan, not by nullifying moral guilt, scholars avoid moralizing the story, but by fulfilling a theological function within that Gnostic scheme. Two clarifications are important here. First, this is a theological reinterpretation internal to the Gospel of Judas and its likely community. It does not in itself show that the historical Judas intended any such salvific role. The Gospel of Judas is a theological document, and like other sectarian writings, it rewrites figures from shared memory to suit its own priorities. Second, the text is fragmentary and ambiguous enough that alternate readings remain plausible. Some scholars read the passage as commending Judas, others see Jesus' words as ironic or as part of a larger polemic. The missing lines and damaged letters mean that competing reconstructions are not merely academic quibbles. They can shift whether Judas is a heroic insider or a tragic figure manipulated by cosmic forces. The broader Gnostic cosmology in the manuscript connects to familiar themes in other apocryphal texts. The idea of emanations from a supreme source, the presence of Barbelo, and the figure of a blind or boastful demiurge who creates the world are all motifs we see in texts such as the Secret Book of John and other second-century writings. The Gospel of Judas, in that sense, participates in a family of theological imaginations that drew on Platonic metaphors, Jewish apocalyptic motifs, and reworked scriptural images into a dense symbolic system. Where it stands out is its insistence that a key part of Jesus' mission within this theological frame involved secret teachings and a ritualized handing over that only a select disciple could enact. That leads to the social and communal implications of the text. It is written as if intended for an initiated circle, people who already have the keys to decode its metaphors. The author assumes knowledge of terms and images that would be obscure to casual readers. This suggests the Gospel of Judas belonged to a confined community, perhaps related to the Sethian strand of Gnosticism, or to groups that prized secret revelation and traced a spiritual lineage back to Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, as the bearer of a special generation. Again, we must be cautious. Labels like Sethian are heuristic and reflect modern scholarly categories. The manuscript itself does not come with a membership roster. But the text's assumed secrecy, its internal language, and the pattern of its concerns align it with texts produced by groups for whom initiation and esoteric knowledge were central. The existence of such a text also explains why early Orthodox critics mentioned a Gospel of Judas. The 2nd-century bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, writing to combat what he called heresies, reports that some groups possessed a gospel that praised Judas rather than condemning him. Irenaeus is polemical. His aim is to show the error of those groups, so his testimony must be read with care. Nevertheless, his mention provides independent evidence that writings with a similar revaluation of Judas circulated in early Christian milieus. In other words, the Gospel of Judas is not a bizarre late invention with no antecedents. It belongs to a broader, contested religious landscape where different communities claimed different interpretations of Jesus and his followers. How have scholars received this manuscript? Most experts agree the Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic text, part of the spectrum of 2nd and 3rd century alternatives to what would become Orthodox Christianity. It illuminates the variety of Christologies, soteriologies, and scriptural reworkings circulating in that era. Many scholars also caution against overstating its historical authority. The text is late relative to the events it describes. It is sectarian and didactic rather than historical reportage, and it comes to us in fragmentary and mediated form. Consequently, the consensus tends to be, the Gospel of Judas teaches us more about the diversity of early Christian thought than about the historical actions or intentions of the historical Judas. Those cautious limits must be repeated. The manuscript does not prove that Judas was innocent in any legal or moral sense. It does not demonstrate a universal secret lost to orthodoxy. It does not overturn the canonical narratives. What it does do is open a window onto how certain communities reimagined core elements of the Christian story to serve their theological aims. It reveals a community that saw salvation as escape from a corrupt material order through knowledge, and that found in Judas a narrative device, a human agent by which the divine plan could be enacted. Because the manuscript is fragmentary, users must also reckon with specific hermeneutical problems. The Coptic text is itself a translation, almost certainly from Greek originals or oral teachings.
Translators must make choices about ambiguous words, damaged letters, and probable grammatical constructions. Some passages are tantalizingly close to making decisive claims, but break off mid-sentence. Occasionally, a pronoun may be unclear. When Jesus says, "He will enter the cloud," who is he? The text's syntactical ambiguities allow for multiple reconstructions. Responsible scholarship, therefore, often offers several competing readings, weighting them on the basis of parallel language in other Gnostic texts, grammar, and the coherence of the theological picture each reading would produce. Another challenge concerns modern editorial and publicity choices. The Codex's public introduction involved not only textual work, but also museum and media decisions. Popular coverage naturally sought a headline-friendly framing, "Judas vindicated," or "Hidden Gospel exonerates traitor." But those claims outstrip what the document can safely support. Good scholarly accounts stress nuance. The Gospel of Judas suggests an alternative interpretation, but does not settle historical questions about the man who betrayed Jesus. What then are the concrete secrets the Gospel of Judas uncovers? First, it reveals that some early Christians reimagined Judas as more than a simple betrayer. Within this text's logic, Judas occupies a complex role that may have been construed as necessary for Jesus' heavenly aspect to be freed from material constraint. Whether we label that vindication or instrumentalization depends on interpretive choices, but the key secret is that the figure of Judas could be redeployed theologically rather than merely demonized. Second, the manuscript makes explicit a Gnostic cosmology in relation to the Christian story. It names a supreme, unknowable God distinct from the maker of the visible world, and sketches a plan of emanative realms and ignorant cosmic rulers. That recoloring of creation and the Creator reframes the problem of evil, the role of ritual, and the purpose of revelation. The Gospel of Judas adds another witness to the fact that a plurality of cosmologies competed for authority in the early centuries. Third, the text underscores a soteriology centered on knowledge rather than sacrificial atonement. Salvation is presented as release through revelation, and membership in the elect or the generation that can be saved is tied to initiation into secrets. That helps historians map how some communities prioritized intellectual and mystical experience as the route to ultimate restoration. Fourth, it shows how secrecy functions socially. Initiation, coded language, and small circles of transmission sheltered a body of teaching that could hardly be expressed in public catechesis. This tells us about the organizational forms of certain early Christian groups, how they maintained boundaries, formed identities, and transmitted authoritative meaning. Finally, the manuscript reveals the fragility of that very evidence. The damaged pages, ambiguous translations, and opaque provenance teach historians a methodological secret. Our picture of early Christianity is always partial and mediated. New finds can shift interpretations, but they rarely settle long-standing debates once and for all. What does the Gospel of Judas not do? It does not become a canonical replacement. It does not present a historical dossier that exonerates Judas as a legal fact. It does not compel theologians to adopt a Gnostic cosmology. Instead, it enlarges the set of voices we can hear from antiquity and reminds us that early Christian identity was contested and plural. There are alternative interpretive moves worth naming briefly. One reading accentuates the sacrificial language and treats Judas as an obedient agent acting at Jesus' request. Another treats the text as ironic or polemical, suggesting that the portrait of Judas serves to critique popular understandings of sacrifice and deity. Yet another highlights continuity with Jewish apocalyptic motifs. Secret knowledge revealed to an insider is a familiar trope across late antique sectarian literature. Each of these readings has implications for how we place the text in the landscape of early Christian thought. None, however, can be demonstrated with absolute certainty given the state of the manuscript. So, where does that leave a curious listener who asked the question at the outset? What secrets are uncovered in the Gospel of Judas discovered in Egypt? The answer in brief is this: The manuscript uncovers an alternative theological universe in which Judas is not merely a betrayer, but a privileged recipient of secret teaching, in which the creator of the material cosmos is distinguished from a higher, unknowable God, in which salvation is construed as return to the pleroma through gnosis, and in which the meaning of Jesus' death can be reinterpreted as part of a salvific release of the divine element. Those are the secrets the text preserves. They are not definitive historical corrections, but windows onto how some early Christians reimagined central elements of the story. Why should a modern audience care? Because the Gospel of Judas shows the plurality of responses to the figure of Jesus in the centuries after his ministry. It helps us see that what later became Orthodox Christianity was one among several competing trajectories. It also invites us to reflect on how communities tell stories about actions we consider morally charged. Recasting a traitor as an instrument of salvation forces a reevaluation of the categories hero and villain in the context of theological imagination. At the same time, the manuscript teaches methodological humility. It warns us that single texts, especially fragmentary, market-recovered codices, cannot overturn a complex historical witness. They do, however, enlarge our sense of the intellectual and spiritual possibilities that early Christians entertained.
They complicate simplistic narratives and encourage nuanced study. If this discussion leaves you wanting to explore further, there are clear next steps. Read Irenaeus's Adversus Hereses to see how early critics describe such writings. Consult modern critical editions and commentaries on the codex, and look at comparative Gnostic texts such as the Secret Book of John and the Gospel of Mary to situate the Gospel of Judas in its broader context. Academic articles on the paleography and Coptic translation choices are essential for anyone who wants to weigh the reliability of particular readings. If this message is speaking to you and you want a deeper series on these texts and their worlds, hit subscribe and join us for the next episodes where we unpack the Gospel of Mary, the Secret Book of John, and the contours of Sethian thought. In the description below, you'll find links to scholarly resources and editions used by historians and philologists. Tell us in the comments which passage you find most puzzling or provocative: Judas as betrayer, Judas as instrument, or the Gnostic cosmology itself. Which interpretation feels most convincing, and why? In the end, the Gospel of Judas does not deliver a final secret that undoes 2,000 years of Christian reflection. Instead, it hands us new coordinates. It reveals a community that reimagined Judas's place in the story, that read creation and salvation through the categories of emanation and knowledge, and that kept these teachings behind a veil of initiation. Those are the real discoveries, not a single conspiracy unmasked, but the diversity of the early Christian imagination and the fragile, precious survival of texts that otherwise might have vanished.